Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I am very sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but um, I'm glad that I'm still able to present in this virtual form. I have amended the title of my presentation slightly, but it did not go through in the system, but it's okay. So yeah, so my presentation today is broadly about the machine translation of Ottoman Turkish into English, and it follows so it starts with this principle that I was trying to capture in the previous title about expanding the availability of sources. This is a reformulation from an undergraduate former intern and collaborator of mine who worked with me in Ottoman Turkish sources and broadly sort of applying natural language processing approaches. And then once we had this one text in our corpus of like 30 plus Ottoman texts that was actually translated into English, for him it was as if there was a curtain between the text and the script because he could not understand the language that we were working with. Still an amazing collaboration of like long years, but it sort of for me really made it clear what it means to be making things accessible to especially to students. And in my presentation, I will briefly talk about like translation in this field of Ottoman studies. I haven't gone into details about machine translation all that much, but then I will be following up with specifically neural machine translation, and then I'll be sharing two tangents of my research. One of them is about the model that I'm fine-tuning myself, and the other one, which will be the broader part of the presentation that I have for you, coming out of the question of generative translation. How can we use LLMs for translation? Can we, and what it means to be doing that? And then I will talk briefly about crowd translation and its potential. So, translation Ottoman studies. So Ottoman studies, Ottoman history, as well as like literary studies, is a broad field that has come out of the sort of like the broader Oriental studies corner in the 19th century onwards. And it is like translation is one of the ways in which scholars try to make the sources that they work with accessible to different audiences who don't necessarily read the language. And these are some examples of recent translations in the field. The middle one is very famous, the Travels of ADHO. It's an early modern, as an early modernist, I sort of like skew toward early modern examples here. And then as well as like the Autumn History Reader and the Prisoner of the Infidels, both are from 2021. But translation is an arduous process, and it's academically not as highly valued as some others, sort of like writing a monograph, publishing articles. So there's still some resistance to sort of producing translations, which changes the availability of the sources that we have to teach with. So this was one of my sort of problems as a graduate student coming into the classrooms teaching at Stanford. I was limited in what I could show and what I could share with my students because they didn't necessarily read Ottoman Turkish. But it also hints at like a broader sort of problem that we have in the history department. More generally, we read and we teach sources only if they're available in translation. It means that like what we have is actually skewed towards who has decided to translate things. And in my field, again, it's impacted by not only the academic sort of trends, but also by like the 19th century Oriental scholarship and what it has been valued as like worth translating and sharing with broader audiences. There are various efforts of translation of Ottoman Turkish, but there's not really a neural machine translation model or any sort of like a translation software, to the best of my knowledge, that specifically targets Ottoman Turkish. This is a company that self-declaredly aims to be the Gale of Ottoman studies, and it is an expensive and highly inaccessible tool. And then there are these what I call the synthetic data projects. So these examples are from a website called Tatoeba, which is the part of like a sort of like a Wikipedia-like initiative of like collecting examples from like communities. And these examples aren't necessarily vetted in any way by the current scholarship. And also, since Ottoman Turkish is a language that doesn't exist today as a live language, it's the language of the Ottoman state, which has not been around for over 100 years. It is kind of, some of the translations are like translating into Ottoman Turkish particularly it's not a scholarly activity. And also these are not necessarily reliable translation. And then what I propose in this sort of environment of it is really difficult to translate because it's not very well valued, and then the existing translation examples that we have aren't very reliable. Maybe like a way to sort of go out of this is to make use of the tools available to us. in this deep learning turn, and try to create a first pass translator for scholars to use. So like my proposition of this project in general is not to sort of replace, but to make it easier for scholars to actually translate the materials that they have and share them with their students, or for like those who are like just starting to learn Ottoman Turkish, translate and get like a translation of like a source that they have available, and then go back to the sections that they're really interested in and do an in-depth analysis of the original source. So it's a sort of like it aims to support and diversify the study of Ottoman Turkish. And so in that sort of purpose, one of the first sections of this project that I ran focused on neural machine translation. So this, some of you might of course like be familiar with this, but broadly speaking, machine translation models of any kind contain parallel sentences in the source language, in this case Ottoman Turkish, and the target language, in this case English. And then the training is done at like it's a sequence translation is a sequence task in which a source language, a source sentence is encoded and a target sentence is decoded. But then we rarely have manuscripts available at sentence level, particularly sort of one-to-one sentence matching doesn't always align between Ottoman Turkish and English. And so there's this very real scarcity of data sets creates an issue in how we like can even potentially train models. And it also is the problem of domain. So the existing translation systems for Turkish, which is a close relative of Ottoman Turkish, don't really have enough examples in domains that would be closer to Ottoman Turkish, say like a Wikipedia text or a news article used today in training a translation model for modern Turkish doesn't really work very well for Ottoman Turkish as like a novel, say, might do. So like based on this premise, I've approached this problem of scarcity by creating my own data set of Turkish novels and a couple of Ottoman works that exist in translation, and splitting them at sentence level. So like at once I'm trying to like increase the number of data sets that we have available, and also try to find data sets that fit with the domain that I am interested in. And this is an example of sentence alignment. I'm happy to take questions about this in the Q&A as well. This is a very sort of like a cool task in the NLP field. And so the question here is like, since we cannot match sentences one-to-one, so this is one sentence in Ottoman Turkish, but its translation is actually here, these two sentences. This is a one-to-one match. And then here we have like additions in sentences, and sometimes they're like removals. So it's a part of translation itself that like you remove, you add, you express content slightly differently. So this is what, this was like one of the main problems that I solved in order to create my data set. And I'm again I will talk about the embeddings that I used for this task. And I ended up acquiring 13 novels in Turkish with English translations. OCR is scanning and OCRing them, and then turning them into sentence data sets and aligning them with the cent-align algorithm. And I've created 3 Ottoman examples. So one of them is an Ottoman novel. The other one is a late 18th century treatise. And then the last one is the treatise of Osmanlı, which I will get into more details later. Again, happy to take questions about translation. And then one of the first things that I tried was fine-tuning an existing Turkish to English translation model. This is Opus MT by Helsinki NLP. It's on Hugging Face, which is the sort of state-of-the-art transformer model. And of the sort of 3 approaches I tried, the most interesting one was for me trying to do a multilingual training. So what happens when we not only put in modern Turkish novels, but also the 2 Ottoman examples that I have in the data, and then tested on the third one. And here are some of the initial results, and I've baselined against large language models as well as the Helsinki's model itself. And this is the multilingual fine-tuning approach, in which you can see like the scores are the blue and CHRF scores are the standard scores that are reported in machine translation, and the blue score measures the accuracy based on words, and the CHRF on characters. Still, the scores are relatively low, but the increase from the baseline model with this multilingual training approach, both in the blue and the CHRF scores, was very promising. And at the same time, I was able to determine that You can see here the performance of various here Gemini 1.5, and then as well as the GPT-4. So there are various models that without any sort of off the shelf performed quite remarkably. Here are some qualitative evaluations. Actually, I will skip these for time considerations because of what I actually want to show you is more of like this part, and I'm happy to go over those examples later in the Q&A. Large language models for translation. So this question of whether we can use generative AI for translation, at first it started from the field itself. So there are already Ottomanists who are like trying these models out for translation, using mostly ChatGPT and like Bard. And I was like, yeah, why not? Like at this point, you might as well be testing these because we're testing them for everything. So obviously, large language models are not translation systems, and then this creates certain sort of technical issues with that. And also, like, there's no sort of consistency across translations and performance. But for low resource languages, large language models can still help bridge the gap. And one thing that I realized as I went more into this, actually large language models are already being deployed for translation. So this was the interest that that this was what really sparked my interest, not only testing how well they're performing in the specific task that I'm interested in, but also what it means for them to be deployed as translation agents. And so this is from Google's own Vertex AI. So it suggests using, like a cloud translation system as well as like a fine-tuned large language model for translation. This is actually a code example that Google has with 1.5 Pro, where like one of their basic examples is translation. Another one is more like sort of like third-party apps that build and combine various large language models to create translation systems. So this sort of like brings the question of like, if this is already happening, why don't we just learn more about what's actually going on in the background? And one of the things that I realized, and specifically with Gemini, is that the safety settings that Google has built on top of the Gemini model actually prevents the model from translating. So this is one example that was blocked, and the block reason for this particular example was hate speech. And so what does that mean? So this really sort of came out of me testing large language models for performance. And then I realized between 14 and 21% of the sentences of one manuscript were not being translated by Gemini. And this one manuscript, Osman Ağa, the third Ottoman example, is actually quite a particular manuscript because it exists only in one copy in the British Library. It has an English translation from 2021, but for since it's been translated into German in the 60s and later transcribed and transliterated in many different ways, it has not been published in English for over like 50 years. And it doesn't coexist. So the translation and the transcription of the script don't coexist, which is actually also quite a curious case because for a lot of other examples in the field, in the field of Ottoman studies, you first create a transliteration of the manuscript and then a translation, and then that usually comes like together hand in hand. But because these with the case of Osman Ağa, because it is split into two separate works, we can safely sort of assume that even if a large language model has seen this work, assuming it has seen everything that is on the internet, it has not really seen it in like a concurrent fashion in any way. But then it contains this sort of like account of a late 17th century Ottoman subject from Bosnia who ended up as a prisoner of war with Austrians for like over 10 years. And it is his story of his imprisonment. So it contains like details of like warfare, of violence, but it's not in any way a particularly gory or a particularly violent manuscript itself. But it talks about hardships of war, which is like a very relevant topic for today's sort of ongoing conflicts all around the world. And yet these models that are already being deployed for translation are refusing to translate accounts that seem to contain hate speech based on certain ideas, certain sort of like ideas of safety that have been implemented in the background of these systems. So I wanted to really go into more details about like what it means to navigate these safety settings. And then Gemini 1.5 came out, and I was able to sort of have a closer look into these. So this is one example of a sentence that was flagged by Gemini's model and not translated. And so we have for these four categories of like safety, hate speech, dangerous content, harassment, and sexually explicit content, we have a probability of that. So we have a severity of how severe a given sort of sentence is in any of these four categories, and a probability of that severity being like the assessment of the model being accurate. So the model also delivers like a score about how sure it is about this assessment. And then the block reason, whether or not it was blocked for one or more of these categories. I ran the whole manuscript split up into sentences, one pass for the entire manuscript and a second pass for only those sentences that have not been translated. For both the Ottoman Turkish copy of this manuscript, and I've acquired a German translation of it, which I've aligned with the English translation to account for the fact that maybe some of these findings that I have regarding safety have to do with the fact that Ottoman Turkish isn't very prevalent in the data set. So I wanted to have, in the training data set of these models, so I wanted to have German as a counter example so that I can have an anchor point to actually sort of argue that these safety blocks are happening because of the contents. And of about 750 or so sentence pairs, 174 of them were not translated. In the German one, there are actually more sentences because it was a better fine-grained match of sentence alignment. But then still, the percentages of like blocked are similar, as well as the distribution of the block categories. So all of these sentences that you see in these two plots have been blocked twice by the model. And as you can see, there's like quite a steep increase, but the increasing severity score, the model also is more sure about its assessments of this. And then broadly speaking, the harassment content has higher severity scores, and dangerous explicit content is all across the line, whereas sexual explicit content has usually lower severity scores. And concerning time, I want to get to some concrete examples. So like broadly speaking, what we see here in the tendencies is that like both the German and the Ottoman Turkish sentences get blocked in very similar manner, which means that like what the analysis that we have in terms of the harm categories and how they're being applied in these large language in the Gemini model doesn't have to do with the language, but to do with the contents. And what actually got blocked? So this example is quite a curious one. It got blocked in all four categories, and I do think this is some kind of a misunderstanding of the word here. Kerhane, which in modern Turkish, is a place of sex work, but it means in Ottoman Turkish a place of work, like a workshop more broadly. And here it's actually used in reference to a blacksmith's workshop, and possibly the word shekels. So otherwise I don't really see any sexually explicit content in here. But then we have sort of these complicated accounts. So we're like, this is warfare. So we're talking about like, how like soldiers are committing different sort of atrocities at war. But then this is the account of like, someone observing a buddy of one of their friends being searched for money and then, like sent down the river. It's, while quite sad and violent and gruesome, it is sort of like also a fact of life. And the same way that this is sort of like in this account, you have like actually a person calling out another person, or like talking to another person who has sexually assaulted potentially a woman, and then that woman reflects that she's afraid to be pregnant. So this is not sexually explicit content. This is sort of content that gets blocked as sexually explicit, but it doesn't mean it is actually the case. And then here's sort of like another example of supposedly sexually explicit content. And what I want to sort of get at from these examples is like using a historical account like that of Osman and testing it on how these models behave in regards to like safety settings and translation actually tells us something very crucial about like what gets lost in broader understandings of AI safety and like broader sort of like testing approaches. These sentences, most engineers would probably like skip. But like the idea is that we can't have these models out deployed in the world without being tested on like actual real accounts. And historical accounts allow for us examples that we can analyze the model behavior on without actually reproducing the harms, because the people who have been mentioned in these accounts, they've been dead for over 300 years. So in a way, I see this research and like the question of generative translation, not only as a question of whether these models can translate Ottoman Turkish, but also like what it means for us to be using these models to translate, and how we can comment upon the broader tendencies in the tech world that push for these models without actually understanding the social implications. Because it is true in so many ways. Like it's impressive that these models can translate up to like 80%, 90% for a language that is not even in the data set in any like significant manner. But also it is quite sort of dangerous for a bunch of engineering decisions being made that says like this is sexually explicit. And it has trickle down effects, because what happens when we have accounts from 2024. And with that, I want to sort of end my presentation and thank you all for listening.